Hi all, it's been a while since my last video. I've been too busy with work to formulate my thoughts for a coherent presentation on many interesting topics. But the recent events in the past week are quite extraordinary, and I felt it's important to provide some clarity as well as contribute to discussion among the tech enthusiast community. The topics I will cover today would be Raja Koduri's move to Intel, along with my thoughts on Vega and Navi. Let's start with the Raja saga. The common question that many of you will ask is why? Was he fired by AMD or lured by Intel? Did Raja help or hindered AMD, and what will be his legacy at AMD? Of course, I have to point out, only those at the table will know the truth. I am not an insider, and so this is only research speculation from third-party info. To understand this whole situation better, we do need to understand the past and what led us to our current situation. If you've seen my previous video, Vega and the Compute Conundrum, you will know that it wasn't long ago when ATI's GPU architecture was the leader in the graphics industry. Note that I do not mean market share, raw performance, or even performance per dollar. As a tech enthusiast, to me, the best architecture is one that delivers high performance with the least power and the fewest transistors because it signifies a true engineering lead. But at around 2008, AMD decided to throw that lead away to turn towards a new direction, one towards a general-purpose GPU computing. The reason? Many believed the shrinking PC gaming market would not last, and the already low profits would not be sustainable given the vast R&D resources required moving forward. The discrete GPU market was also volatile because of fierce competition. ATI and Nvidia traded blows, and when either wasn't on top, they had a major drop in revenue and profits. Nvidia's CEO, Jensen Huang, realized they had to diversify away from PC graphics much earlier, and so CUDA and Tesla accelerators were born. The idea was that these new markets would dampen the volatility of the PC graphics revenue, and it worked. As we saw, when there's strong competition from AMD GPUs, Nvidia still made a profit, and a large chunk was due to the professional market. In essence, Quadro and Tesla revenue enabled further R&D investments, even if the PC gaming market was volatile. Returning to Raja and AMD, as you may know, Raja has a long history at ATI and was one of their major graphics engineers. When ATI merged with AMD, under the leadership of Hector Ruiz, AMD believed combining the CPU and the GPU would enable AMD to be the sole player in the emerging graphics market, where Intel could not compete. The drive for this fusion approach was strong, and the ATI crew were well funded. Morale was high, and people were passionate. During this time, Raja contributed with the TeraScale architecture, optimized for graphics. The efficiency allowed AMD to have a strong presence in notebooks and to recover close to 50% of the PC market share. However, AMD was suffering financially during these periods due to the overwhelming bribes that Intel paid to major OEMs to not buy superior AMD CPUs. This topic, though, was thoroughly covered by Jim over at Adore TV, so I will not go into it. There's a link in the description for those interested. Basically, to survive the tough times, AMD needed to restructure, a euphemism for firing many good hard-working staff. The new CEO, Dirk Meyer, felt that his predecessor had gone off focus with the ATI acquisition along with others, and moved to refocus AMD back to its core business, that is CPUs and servers. Also under Dirk Meyer, the decision was made to drop the focus on making the most efficient graphics architecture, because many thought that the future of gaming would be on consoles and mobiles. What's left of ATI had to refocus to develop a brand new general-purpose architecture so that AMD could compete in the emerging HPC market with their own accelerators. Now, if you've studied up on Raja's career and him as a person, you will know that Raja is first and foremost a graphics guy. It is indeed his passion to bring great computer graphics to as wide an audience as possible. Because of AMD's new GPU focus and the shrinking ATI budget, along with ever smaller staff, Raja decided to take an offer from Apple to lead the graphics engineering teams, so he left AMD in 2009. Coincidentally, Jim Keller, a renowned CPU architect who was also at AMD, left to join Apple around this time. It's no wonder then, with the talent and budget available, Apple quickly became the industry leader in CPU and graphics on mobiles. Fast forward a few years to 2011, and AMD was in dire position, with bankruptcy looming on the horizon. Rory Reid was the new CEO, and his mission was to do whatever it takes for AMD to survive until the new CPU architecture, being developed by Jim Keller, who had also returned to AMD, was finished and launched. Reed also leveraged AMD's graphics technologies and IP to start the semi-custom and embedded business, leading to major wins in the Xbox and the PS4, which provided revenue to keep them afloat. In 2011, AMD also launched GCN to consumers with the Radeon 7970. Immediately, it was obvious that this architecture was not optimized for gaming graphics. It was a relatively large and power-hungry chip by AMD standard, on a new 28nm node, and was only 30% faster than the previous gaming flagship, the TeraScale 6970. 30% may sound like a lot by today's standards, but back in the days, a true generation and node leap yielded typically 80 to 100% performance gains. Nvidia was very happy with the situation because it meant that they no longer had to compete with AMD in gaming using a much larger and power-hungry general-purpose GPU like they were forced to do for many years. Instead of selling big Kepler to compete against more mid-range AMD GPUs, they could actually sell their own mid-range Kepler at a high price. A chip such as GK104, instead of being sold at $299, sold well at $499. Meanwhile, Big Kepler, instead of being $499, it sold at $699. Of course, no one should blame Nvidia for taking the opportunity given to them. It was in fact Rory Reid who let this happen, by pricing a mid-range chip such as Tahiti at $549. The justification being that it was faster than the previous Nvidia Fermi flagship, the $500 GTX 580. When we think about this logically, it is perfectly normal for a next-gen mid-range chip to displace the prior-gen high-end at actual mid-range prices. That's actually real progress and the result of innovation. Because TeraScale was superior in graphics, it enabled fierce competition which drove down GPU prices. GCN was barely competitive versus Kepler in graphics, and its pricing caused the floodgates to open, allowing Nvidia to grow the gaming revenue and profits to unprecedented levels. Meanwhile, GCN, which was designed for general purpose compute, and actually very good at it, never stood a chance in those lucrative markets. What AMD didn't plan for, because their leadership came from CPU backgrounds, is how important software is to succeed in the GPU accelerator market. A CPU doesn't need an insanely complex driver layer or a major software stack to enable it to perform. A GPU does. Nvidia and Jensen Huang are especially aware of this fact, and so CUDA was designed first and foremost to secure their gains in these markets. The entrenchment of CUDA is real and something not even Intel, with vastly more industry connections and money, can easily displace. Basically, AMD already lost the battle the moment they half-hearted and with a small budget decided to enter into Nvidia's established GPU domain. At around this time, Lisa Su became the senior vice president of AMD. She, very much like Rory Reid, understood the need to diversify, but she also knew how important the gaming market is. As such, a strong graphics architecture was required to compete, but AMD cannot have a clean slate restart because GCN backwards compatibility is a critical factor for their lifeline, the semi-custom business. Also, the promise of the growing HPC market and the emerging AI and MI markets was too great not to pursue. Lisa wanted a single GPU architecture that can do it all and do it well. No easy task as you can imagine. Raja Koduri was asked to return to AMD to lead the graphics division and tasked with creating a future GCN ISA-compatible architecture that would enable AMD to compete in all their markets. Now is where I have to point out something very important that a lot in this community don't realize or want to discuss. Guys like Jim Keller and Raja Koduri are highly respected, the cream of the crop in their fields. They would have received offers from many companies, some of which undoubtedly carry a huge paycheck and a well-funded division for them to lead. Why did they return to AMD, which was struggling financially and as far as they knew back then was heading towards bankruptcy? Their return to AMD was not about money, it was about saving the company and the jobs of many good people. Ultimately, it is because of loyalty and friendships, and for that, we have to give them due respect. Back to the GPU topic. A major architecture always takes a long time in this industry. Typically 3 to 4 years ahead is the time frame when major engineering decisions reach the market. While Raja may have influenced Polaris, it was mostly completed before his work at AMD began. Vega, however, certainly would be the result of Raja's guidance. While gaming performance of Vega leaves many wanting more, the biggest problem with Vega is actually it's late. Had it launched in Q4 2016, even as a 1080 or 1070 competitor, it would have a better reception. Why was it late? Mostly due to HBM2. Vega engineering samples were running in 2015. It didn't launch until 2 years later, which is one of the longest delays as far as I can recall for a GPU. HBM2 schedules were pushed back by SK Hynix as they had yield issues, and Micron's HBM2 production was completely bought out by Nvidia for the P100 Tesla. The question some of you may ask is why Vega needs HBM2 at all. Contrary to what most people think, it is not power related, not memory footprint issues, and certainly not bandwidth given rising GDDR5 speeds and new developments. As I've talked about before, an important unique property of HBM2 is within the memory banks itself. GDDR5 and such are very good for transfers of large chunks of data, but they are very slow for rapid read and write cycles of small chunks of data to the same memory banks. HBM2 is good for both workloads, and in the HPC market, fast fine-grained read-write cycles of very small pages is an important feature to have. Features like the high bandwidth cache and the unified virtual memory require this ability to really shine. It's a major reason why Nvidia's P100 Tesla uses HBM2. Vega 10 is a general-purpose architecture designed for servers, AI, and machine learning. Its design also enables some novel solutions such as the Pro SSG for big data acceleration and film studio workloads. But is it also a gaming architecture? Did Raja accomplish the mission given to him to make it good for gaming as well? Clearly not. Not yet. GCN's weakness has always been the loop-sided compute-focused design with few transistors dedicated to graphics, namely geometry and rasterization. To simplify this issue, imagine a typical frame of a game being rendered by the GPU. It will comprise of several elements such as vertices, geometry, textures, becoming pixels which are then post-processed with shader effects. If a GPU is limited by geometry and rasterization, it will scale poorly in performance even with more cores, since all of the extra raw teraflops of computing power cannot contribute to some of the steps involved in creating a frame. Another interesting aspect of graphics rendering is that gamers often assume different resolutions scale uniformly, as in all the elements scale, but it is not true. Vertices and geometry workloads do not change much at 720p versus 4K resolution. It's static, while what changes are rasterization, pixel shaders, and post-processing workload. A GPU that's geometry bound with ample shading power will be slow at low resolution, while relative performance increases at high resolution as the workload emphasis switches to pixel-related shaders. This is the typical observed performance profile of GCN, especially in very loop-sided designs like VG. With Vega, we do see better scaling. There's a consistent strong lead in performance over Polaris and Hawaii, even at low resolutions where relative geometry performance matters more. This is very much due to the new scheduler changes, which dynamically assign work to the 4 geometry engines to lift efficiency of these units. The intelligent workgroup distributor, which is designed to assign work to idling compute units first, also helps in increasing shader usage at low resolution. The scheduler also has a larger SRAM cache for storing more instructions, alleviating CPU stalls, leading to a high performance under CPU-bound scenarios. But these hardware improvements are not enough. Vega 56 has raw performance that should allow it to match the GTX 1080 in graphics, while Vega 64 should be closer to the 1080 Ti. The problem still is geometry and rasterization bottlenecks, because these changes only lift the bottleneck ceiling a little, while what GCN really needs is to break through that ceiling entirely. Primitive shaders, if it's implemented by game developers or by AMD, will help with the vertice and geometry steps, so performance can improve, but a bottleneck still remains with rasterization. Importantly, Nvidia has moved on with deferred rasterization and gained its efficiency advantage, while AMD is still on immediate mode rasterization. On top of this, AMD has less resources on GCN dedicated to rasterization overall, so a GCN teraflop will not equal a Pascal or Volta teraflop in graphics until this bottleneck is lifted. What GCN really needs is the lifting of the 4 shader engine limitation. It needs to be dynamic, scalable, just like Nvidia's polymorph engines and graphics processing clusters. Of course, this requires more transistors dedicated to graphics function, which results in a bigger die that uses more power. This is the downside of making a single chip for many markets. I believe that the foundation for this change is already within Vega's scheduler and front end, but a bigger and more power-hungry chip was off the table because of a combination of limited resources, but also it does not make economic sense at this time. The solution should be obvious by now if you are a tech enthusiast. Look at the accomplishment of Zen and its scalability. AMD uses extra die space with Zeppelin to enable scalability with the Infinity fabric, but they make up for it by not needing to produce one giant power-hungry chip to reach higher performance levels. Raja has talked about the future of GPUs being multi-small dies working together for a while, and the foundation is done for Navi to succeed. Let me explain why Navi is capable of being an all-in-one architecture. To specialize a chip for HPC, or AI and MI, like Vega, you require more transistors and you increase the power usage. Compared to a graphics optimized chip, it will lose in performance per watt and performance per millimeter square, both critical metrics to be successful. Here's the thing, what if performance per millimeter square no longer matters because your production yields are so high, since you do not need to make a huge die, but multiple small ones? Remember, yield is exponentially related to die size. A smaller die not only yields a little better, but a lot, and so production cost is lower while production rate is higher. It should be clear immediately how Navi could be inefficient in performance per millimeter square and still be cheap to produce in mass quantities. But what about power? For GPUs, you simply go with lower clocks, lower voltage, and make up for the performance loss by having more cores. Basically, performance per watt can increase at the expense of performance per millimeter square. If die space is no longer a limiting factor, such as a multi-chip solution, the performance per watt issue will solve itself in the process. There's some concerns about the difficulties of making a multi-die single GPU, but it's actually an easier task than with CPUs. Unlike CPU workloads where thread dependencies are high, where out-of-order execution can happen, and latency is critical, GPU workloads are incredibly parallel and non-thread dependent. GPUs also hide latencies very well, unlike CPUs. The next question is, how can GCN go wider over multi-dies? Well, by not being limited to 4 shader engines, and with a scheduler clever enough to keep many shader engines well fed. You see, Vega has already laid that foundation for Navi. But that's not really the end for Vega. As I've stated in my other video, if fine wine is what you enjoy, Vega is the finest of wines. All that untapped FP16 power, as new games begin to tap it, there's potential there for some really strong gains. Due to a lack of gaming driver optimizations, the performance of RX Vega currently is nowhere near its potential, and so AMD had to sell them at a lower price than they hoped for to compete. In essence, as a gamer, you get competitive performance for your money today, but with a lot of untapped power under the hood. Does this make Vega 10 a failed GPU design? Far from it. It is solid as MA25 and for professionals. Vega 10's inclusion in arguably the best mass-produced workstation, the new iMac Pros, is also a testament to its one-chip-for-all market design. One could say professional Vega is subsidizing RX Vega for gamers, an identical situation Nvidia was in when they had to sell big and power-hungry chips for low prices to gamers. With the typical volumes that Apple iMacs sell, and this upcoming model being the most anticipated in years, it is obvious to me that revenue from Vega will ramp in 2018 and it will pay for its R&D costs many folds. This, combined with the resurgent AMD CPU business, should put much needed money in AMD's coffers to hopefully increase the odds of a smoother Navi launch. Finally, regarding Raja's move to Intel, it is not something that happens quickly, a betrayal as some calls it. These moves, along with AMD and Intel collaborations, would have been discussed a long time ago. Anyone with experience in large institutions know these things take time. Certainly, backporting Polaris to support HBM2 and Intel's EMIB technology is not a quick task. And we know that engineering sample has been in the wild for a long time. From what I've managed to dig up, Raja was personally affected by being asked to do too much with too little. This forced him into demanding his RTG staff to work extra hard with constant overtime. They had to get AMD's Pro drivers up to scratch, to utilize Vega features on PC workstations, and to make it compatible with OS X and the Metal 2 API. On top of this, they also had to create entire new HPC, AI, and MI software stacks, and CUDA to OpenCL compilers, which is a huge endeavor by itself. All the while, they have to keep up with gaming optimizations for past and current GPUs. For a software team a fraction the size of Nvidia's, and I cannot stress this enough, this was simply unfair to all those workers. I'm a software guy and I feel for those in AMD's driver team. So while gamers want the primitive shaders enabled, it is just not at the top of their priority. Lisa Su had to ensure Zen succeeds above all else because AMD's survival was at stake, and so this limited the resources available for RTG. Tough decisions were made, and it's clear now that the partnership with Apple, Baidu, and others in the professional market was more important. When you think about it, Intel's bribes over a decade ago still carry deep consequences for AMD to this day. Meanwhile, it barely cost Intel anything in terms of fines. I realize this is why some call Raja's move to Intel a betrayal, because he's joined the enemy. But times have changed. People have to move on from the past to find a solution for the future. Raja joined Intel for the same reason that Jim Keller had when he left AMD to work for Tesla, 2 years before Zen was released to consumers. Basically, the mission was done and it's time for a new challenge. Raja had good working relationships with important leaders at Intel during their collaboration. They recognized his talent and they wanted to grow markets where graphics and GPU accelerators are a priority. Of course, a bigger paycheck and a huge R&D budget for his own division to lead is a big drawcard. While there's so many interesting topics to discuss, and I could go on, this video is long enough. I hope this one was insightful, and as always, feel free to discuss anything related, whether you agree or disagree in the comments. See you all next time.